Are we at the cusp of finding alien life?
I would say that without doubt, I would say that in the next, 10, 20, 30 years, we are going to have actual data that is relevant to the question. I can't tell you what the data is going to say, but we have the tools now and the technology and the theoretical understanding to actually look for alien life where it would live, which would be alien planets.
Yeah, I've heard you say this a couple of times, that over the next 10 to 20 years, we'll have hard data to be able to debate the question as to how many alien civilizations there may be out there. What gives you the confidence that we'll have that hard data?
All right. Now, again, civilizations are a next level. I would be happy finding any kind of life. If we found evidence for just a biosphere, that would be absolutely revolutionary. So as much as, we all are really interested in civilizations, life is so weird and bizarre and unlike anything else in the universe that finding even a planet that was inhabited purely by a microbial biosphere would be the most stunning scientific discovery in the history of humanity. So just want to make sure, that's because civilizations is like another 5 or 6 levels up. But the reason we have confidence in that is that two things. In 1995, we discovered the first exoplanet, first planet orbiting another star. And that was a 2,000-year-old question. You could see the Greeks arguing about whether or not there were any other planets in the universe other than the ones that we knew about, which all orbit our sun. They didn't know that, but so we found that in 1995, and then since then we have now found the universe is awash in planets, and since life is probably requires a planetary surface or ocean to evolve in. That was a huge discovery. And then we figured out how to use our ever better telescopes to peer into the atmospheres of these worlds. We can actually characterize the atmospheres of these distant worlds. And that data is what's going to allow us to tell whether or not there's life on the planet, either, simple life or technological life, because biospheres change their planets and they leave imprints in terms of what stuff is in the atmosphere. In a way that, if we could talk about these, if we find biosignatures or technosignatures, meaning specific chemical compounds in the atmospheres, that's going to allow us to infer that there is a biosphere or technosphere on the planet.
I wonder, and this is a question I really like to, and I posed this to Avi Loeb as well, is that with someone like yourself immersed in the world of academia, obviously there's a lot of politics that goes on in academia. I wonder how these subjects are viewed from inside that world of academia, challenges around things like funding and ultimately how someone is looked upon by their peers when they're exploring conversations of finding life out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it used to be if you were trying to do this in 1960, so again, when you talk about life, it's really important to distinguish the idea of technological life and regular life. So, in 1960, there was no way to find life of any kind. And actually the first ever, what we'll call an astrobiological experiment, right? Not just sitting there thinking about it or doing an experiment in a laboratory about the origin of life. But the first ever actual experiment was Frank Drake looking for signals or evidence of advanced life in terms of technology. So in the beginning, really all there was SETI, right? What we now call the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And for many years, that was quite marginal within the scientific community. It was never well funded. It was always, there were some great scientists who were pioneers in it, but they were heroic in their willingness to sort of, endure their other people's scorn, or at least, eyebrows raised. Now, NASA was always interested in this, and there was some funding for it, but there was never a lot. So, when I was a graduate student, way back when, in the, in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s, any kind of search for life was still sort of seen as a little bit wacky, except for actually landing probes on planets in the solar system. So, Mars, or that was still, kind of maybe a going thing. But even by the early 90s, that was seen as being a dead end because the Viking program in the 70s had landed on Mars. And there was a life detection experiment that gave either negative or ambiguous results. So people were kind of like, Mars sucks. It's probably not a good place. But certainly if you were looking for evidence of life elsewhere in the universe, outside of our solar system, it was definitely seen as either there was nothing to do, or if you were looking for using radio to look for signals of a technological life, it was definitely seen as marginal. But then along came 1995, and you discover the first exoplanets, and then you begin to start developing the technologies as well. The term is atmospheric characterization. So in the beginning of the 2000s, we started like peering into these atmospheres or figuring out how to do that. And then everything changed. And, astrobiology is now probably considered one of the most exciting fields in astronomy. And in fact, if you want evidence for this, every 10 years, the astronomical community gets together and produces what they call the decadal survey. And it's basically everybody in astronomy argues and sends in papers about what the next 10 years should be about. And NASA uses this to decide what kind of giant telescope we're going to build. So in the 2020 decadal survey, what was named as one of the key projects, is something called the Habitable Worlds Observatory. Right? This is what would replace the James Webb Space Telescope in 20 or 30 years, right? That's why I use that number. The answer is in the name, the Habitable Worlds Observatory. One of its missions is going to be to find life. So the idea that looking for biosignatures is wacky, that's over. Like NASA is all the way in. There is research funding for it. Careers are being built. Now, technosignatures, right? Searching for evidence of technological life, that was still, up until, actually, I can give you a date. Up until 2018, that was still seen as being kind of like, why are we doing that? And a lot of the old people, even my age, were like, that's crazy. Why would you do that? And then NASA, actually, the way this worked was somebody in Congress told NASA, we're going to give you $10 million to do technosignatures. And NASA was like, what? Do what? So they held a meeting where they invited a bunch of us who were interested in it to advise them on what would we do if we got $10 million? And that was the beginning of the modern era of technosignatures. And to me, even that was the beginning, for me at least. Stop using the word SETI. It's about technosignatures. You're not looking, actually, what are you looking for? You're not looking for intelligence. You're looking for technology, right? Because intelligence, how do you even define that? And so since then, for example, I am the principal investigator on the first grant. A bunch of us got together and put in a grant that was funded in 2019, the first grant that NASA ever gave to look at exoplanets and figure out how would you look for technosignatures. And since then, the ball has really been rolling. And I think there's still some astronomers who would, raise their eyebrows. But here's the main thing. If you're already looking for biosignatures, and we can talk about what those are, why would you say, yeah, but don't talk to me about technology, right? Don't go looking for any evidence of technology. Why would you do that? It's stupid. You're already looking for biosignatures. The same way you're going to look for biosignatures is the way you're going to look for technosignatures. They'll be in the same data that you collect. So it just, that kind of bias, which was very old, was from, the 60s, and also got very influenced because of UFOs, because of all the wackiness that went on with UFOs. I think people now, scientists, when it comes to technosignatures, are like, yeah, okay, tell us how you're going to do it.
And so just so we're defining everything for our audience as we go along, when you're saying biosignatures, what exactly are you referring to there?
Yeah, so that would be a signature in the light from a distant planet that told you there was biology there. So the classic example is oxygen, right? So Earth, this is an amazing fact. On Earth, life started, say, 3.8 billion years ago. But when it started, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. And for the next billion years or more, there's still no oxygen in the atmosphere. An entire microbial rich biosphere grew up with zero oxygen in the atmosphere. And then it was life that invented a new form of photosynthesis that pumped the oxygen into the atmosphere. So now we have 21% oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. It's all there because of life. And if life went away tomorrow, all that oxygen would disappear pretty quickly. It would get bound back up in rocks. So unless life keeps belching oxygen back into the atmosphere, because all the things that plants and, phytoplankton and such do, there'd be no oxygen. So if you saw a planet that was like Earth and you took a spectra, took its light and broke up the light based on wavelength, and you looked for the signatures of different chemical compounds, carbon dioxide, whatever, helium, and you saw oxygen, that would be like a strong indicator that there was a big, can I curse?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, big ass biosphere on that planet. So a biosignature is a signature in the light that tells you there's biology there. A technosignature would be the exact same thing, only now technology. So for example, say you're looking at the light from a planet, you break it up into a spectra, you're looking at all the different imprints, all the lines, we call them lines. They're just, they're basically just indicators of it's like a fingerprint. In the light, there's fingerprints of whatever is in the atmosphere. And if you found chlorofluorocarbons, right, which are the stuff that we pumped out by mistake, from our air conditioning, if you saw that in the atmosphere, you would be like, oh my God, there's technology there, because nature does not produce chlorofluorocarbons. So that's an example of a technosignature. There's many others we could talk about, but that's the distinction.
Amazing. Now, so with you being someone who's actually in the arena doing this, what work or ongoing research at the moment is exciting you the most? What's getting you fired up right now?
Well, okay, I'm interested in both biosignatures and technosignatures. So, for example, a group that was looking at a new kind of planet, a kind of planet that we don't have in our own solar system, something that we call a sub-Neptune. It's a planet with like 8 Earth masses. And they hypothesized that this planet might have, rather than being a big, cold, icy slush ball, which is what Uranus and Neptune are like, this planet might have an atmosphere of hydrogen, and below that, an ocean, a huge ocean, like 600 miles deep. Whereas, our ocean at the deepest is 6 miles, right? But that kind of planet might be the kind of planet that could host life. So we found an entirely new kind of planet that could host life. And when they looked at the spectra, they saw some wiggles in the place where dimethyl sulfide would be. Dimethyl sulfide is, if you found that would be a biosignature. Now, even they were like, this is not dimethyl sulfide, like this is not a detection. But it was like, oh, cool. Like, oh, all right. If there was a planet with dimethyl sulfide, an ocean world, and we looked at it long enough to gather better data, maybe we would find something like that. So that's super exciting. We're waiting now. JWST is looking at, there's a series of there's a planetary system called the TRAPPIST-1 system. And it's a brown dwarf, a small star, and it's got, I think, like 8 planets all in a row. And a few of them are in the habitable zone. And we're working our way outward with the JWST to look whether there's an atmosphere on any of them, right? Because if there was an atmosphere, that's a first step towards thinking about life. So the first two the first one definitely didn't have an atmosphere, which is fine because it's like Mercury. You don't expect it. So close to the star, you wouldn't expect it. The second one was like, maybe not, but maybe. But that one still isn't what we call the habitable zone, the zone where we think there could be life because of the planet would be just at the right temperature to have liquid water in its surface. So we're all waiting for the next data dump to see whether or not the third planet out has an atmosphere. So, this is all super exciting because we're actually getting data, right? It's actually about data. And then theoretically, on the technosignature front, the group that I'm part of, we've just been doing great work, really interesting, fun stuff about kind of figuring out what kinds of technosignatures are good to look for. So we did a paper on chlorofluorocarbons. We've been looking at the idea if somebody terraforms a planet, right? This is an old science fiction idea, right? You take a planet that sucks and then you start pumping atmospheres into it, right? So, people have thought about doing this with Mars for a long time. Lots of great movies where this, Mars gets terraformed. Aliens, if you ever watched the movie Aliens, the second one in the series, right, which is terrifying, that's on a world that is being terraformed. I think the battle that she has, that what's her name? What's the name of the character? Wrigley.
Yeah.
Rigby. Wrigley.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I should remember, man, because I'm a science fiction nerd. I should know this. That actually happens in a terraforming sort of facility on. So that's one of the things we've been looking at. How would you be able to tell whether planets are being terraformed? So lots of really fun, exciting stuff that nobody's ever thought about before. And, now we're finally, science is thinking about it systematically.
Yeah, that's really encouraging because, as you alluded to earlier, a lot of people say they gave up on the search for life being a compelling subject when we've looked around our solar system. There's very little evidence or no evidence. But when I spoke to Avi Loeb, he suggested to me that whilst we can't necessarily search for life outside of our immediate solar system, that we can almost search for tennis balls that have landed in our backyard, so to speak. So what's your view on this and the way we should be approaching the search for life?
Yeah, well, first of all, the solar system is actually a lot more interesting than we might have thought years ago because we've got these ocean moons, right? So around Jupiter and Saturn, which are both giant, gaseous planets, there are these moons that we now have very good evidence, for that they have oceans underneath, either underneath kind of like a frozen mud surface, or in the case of Europa, which is one of the most interesting, the whole surface is ice. The whole surface is like a 10-kilometer deep layer of ice sitting on top of 100-kilometer deep ocean. And so who the hell knows what's down there? We just can't get there, right? So we got to figure out how to investigate the ocean while not being able to get into the ocean, at least now. So those worlds there could be rich ecosystems down there. We just don't know. And there's water. There's lots of liquid water. And, all of us believe that liquid water is probably a really good bet. It may not be that you absolutely need liquid water to make life, but everything we understand about life is that water is it's got everything you want. If you were going to build life from scratch, you'd do it in water. So, that part is super exciting. Now, when it comes to what we might say artifacts, I'm not a big fan of UAP stuff, UAP and UFO stuff. I just really feel that I'm all for open scientific investigations of them. But the idea that we have any data that really is whoa, my God, that's just not true. There's no data in existence or has been that really, for a scientist would make you be like, oh, damn, we're being visited. So on that level, I think, the UAP stuff is not that interesting from a scientific point of view, especially in terms of where am I going to spend my time looking? I've only got so many years to be a scientist. Where am I going to put my money down? But there is this idea of artifacts that, if somebody came through 1 billion years ago, and set up shop for a while, where might we find, evidence left over? The Earth's surface is a terrible place to look because of weathering, right? Pretty much everything gets weathered out after 1 million years. So you're not going to find anything here, but the moon might be an interesting place to look, or special orbits where the orbit doesn't decay, where something could sit for 1 billion years. That's an interesting place to look at. So that is actually it's a small subfield of technosignatures, but it's out there. And, I've done some work on that myself.
Yeah. Well, the sort of UFO stuff's probably not very interesting to you. It's more of a armchair scientist, field of study, that one. But
right.
I've heard you explain that, say, if you imagine the space as an ocean, that we've explored a hot tub's worth of that ocean that's out there, right? So, what are the next steps? How do we go beyond that hot tub?
Hot tub, yeah, right. So, it's worthwhile just unpacking this maybe a little bit for the people who are listening. So, there's this thing called the Fermi paradox, right? Which I'm sure you've heard of. Some of your listeners may have heard of. And the Fermi paradox, goes way back to Enrico Fermi. It was a lunchtime conversation, but he basically asked. He was like, "Where is everybody?" And one way to formulate the Fermi paradox is that people say, "Well, look, we've looked. We've been doing radio SETI since 1960. We haven't found anything." So therefore, there's nothing out there. But that is completely wrong. And the reason it's completely wrong is what we were talking about earlier, is that, SETI was never viewed as being like a going concern. There was never any funding for it. So anybody who did SETI searches was doing it on the sly or doing it, kind of on the side. So they're just, the reason why there is no Fermi paradox is because we haven't looked, people have this idea that every night astronomers are searching the sky for intelligent signals, and then nothing could be further from the truth. And so, as you pointed out, so Jason Wright, one of my collaborators, and his team did this study where they looked at all the SETI research that's ever been done, and what the conclusion was, there hasn't been, we have really not searched at all. So given that fact, what's next? Well, the cool thing is, finally now, there's research funding. You need funding to be able to use a telescope. Telescopes are very expensive to use. So now there is finally funding. There's the building of a research community, right? Because what has to happen is, with science takes a long frickin' time. You gotta plan years in advance, because the technology to do an experiment takes years, decades to develop. And you've got to have graduate students. I mean, you have to have a community of people who are asking a question. They then, it takes a few years to ask and answer the first level of that question, and then come the next level of that questions. And then that's going to be like the graduate students you're training. They'll take on that. You have to have a community that extends over time, and a tradition, a research tradition, all these things that make science work, right? The reason why you and I are having this incredible conversation, even though I'm in Rochester, New York, and you're in Wales, is because research on quantum mechanics, research on electromagnetic fields, optics. That's why all this incredible shit works. If it wasn't for that, I couldn't build this. I don't know how to build the camera that's sitting there. So it's the same thing with the Technosignatures and Biosignatures, is that finally the funding and the interest is there to build the kind of long-term investment in this research that will yield answers. And again, science is also a long game. So think about something like gravitational waves. So Einstein in 1918 lays down the theory that predicts you can actually have ripples in space and time. The very fabric of reality can ripple if you have if you have big masses orbiting each other. And, people were looking for that. They thought about that for 100 years. And they were only discovered about, I think it was 2015 that they were finally discovered. So, looking for life is the biggest question we've ever asked. And, 20 or 30 years, that's only going to be the beginning, right? Imagine, even if we don't find anything in 20, 30 years, it's not like, well, we're done. Because even then we will have maybe begun to search, 3 hot tubs worth of, or whatever, or, oil tankers worth of the sky, so to speak. If the sky is the ocean, is an ocean,
Yeah, and I suppose a sort of deeper question than where it is when. And I know you worked on a paper about this called the Silurian Hypothesis, which is a great reference, by the way. And for anyone listening, if you know, you know. And it was whether it would be possible to detect an industrial civilization in the geological record. So what did you find through this paper? Could you talk our audience through this?
Yeah, sure. So this paper came out. The story of this paper is super fun. So my the 2 books ago or 3 books ago, I wrote a book called Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of the Earth. So I've always been very interested in climate change because, my first job, actually I took a year and a half between undergraduate and graduate. And I did, I planted trees in Canada. I was a bouncer at the Rocky Horror Picture Show in New York. And then I got a job at this NASA facility in uptown New York, right? And I was just a scientific programmer. And the thing that this is 1986. I asked them about, what are we doing here? What and the woman sat me down and said, well, it's possible that the climate is changing because of human activity. And we're interested in if that's true or not. So since then, I've always had a strong interest in climate change, and sometimes when I do podcasts, I'll see in the comments people are like, "Oh, he lost me when he talked about climate change," and I'm going to say this: anybody who's listening, if you think climate change isn't happening, sorry, science has left you behind, right? This is not, whether climate change is happening or not is not a political issue. What you do about it, sure, you can be political, but the idea that it's some kind of hoax or something. Sorry, man. There's just no basis on that. And so I'm sorry but I see this and I just want to put that to bed right away. Climate change is happening. And the book, what I asked in the book, the research I was starting to do, so it's part of this story. Sorry for going on. But I was wondering, maybe climate change is kind of a natural step that any technological civilization reaches, right? Because what's happening with climate change is just that it's about human beings being so freaking successful, right? We harvest so much energy from the planet and use it to build civilization that it's having a feedback. Like, duh. Like, what do you expect to happen? We're using 25% of the total energy that the biosphere uses for our own needs. Of course, there's going to be a feedback. So I was asking whether or not maybe every civilization hits this point. You become powerful enough and you start to affect the planet on which you live. So this was obviously kind of a, out there idea. And I went to see Gavin Schmidt, who's the head of the research institute that I worked in 1986. He now runs it. He's a great climate scientist. And I went in because I wanted to talk to him about this. And I said, look, I got this crazy idea that maybe aliens trigger climate change. And I said, I know it's crazy, and of course there's never been any other civilization on Earth. So I've got to, and he said, well, how do you know that? And I was like, my jaw dropped, because I thought I was going in there with the craziest freaking idea anybody had ever heard, aliens triggering climate change. And he just totally outdid me. Crazy. Like, how do you know there's never been another civilization on Earth? And he wasn't saying that there was. He was asking, and this is what's so beautiful about science, he was asking a question that nobody had ever asked before. Yeah. How would you know if there was another technological civilization on Earth, say 500 million years ago? Because what happens is the Earth, the surface of the Earth is constantly being reshaped by plate tectonics. So there literally is no ground left over, or just small amounts of actual Earth, continental exposed continents that was around 500 million years ago. So if you had a vibrant technological civilization that, say, lasted 10,000 years, which would be, we've only been around like 200 years as a technological civilization, how would you know? Where would you look for clues? So he called this. So what we did is we did a paper, and it was mostly him doing the earth science to ask the question, how would you know? What markers would be left that you could detect after 500 or, after millions of years? Now, people always go, well, fossils. Of course, there's going to be fossils. That's really debatable. Again, because the earth shifts, there wouldn't be, and well, it's not so much that, it's more that the fossil record is very incomplete, right? People think like, oh, there's fossils of everything. The fossils we have of ancient life on Earth constitutes a tiny fraction of all of the species that were around then. So most things, the majority of things do not get fossilized. So if you had a 10,000 year long civilization, which is, a blink of the eye geologically, you probably wouldn't get fossils. Now I think that's still an open research question, people need to look at. But let's assume that it's true that that's just too short for, to leave any imprints. So then you'd have to look at things like the strata, the rock strata, and look for clues, like isotopic clues, like the composition of those strata. Can you see like, oh, wow, there's like weird levels of, certain kinds of chemicals that you wouldn't expect. So he called this whole idea the Silurian Hypothesis, because he's a Doctor Who fan. And there's the Silurians are the lizard people in they're an ancient species, from their prehistoric Earth. So that was the idea that we looked at. It's funny because it got a huge amount of press. And of course, we weren't saying there was a technological civilization. We were just saying, how would you know? And so, yeah, that was really super fun. But it became very important for Technosignatures, because it just also forced you to ask, what is the trajectory of a technological civilization on a planet, right? So what I was asking was, does everybody trigger climate change? And maybe some people don't get through it, right? They're not smart enough to be like, oh, the energy source we're using, in our case, fossil fuels, has a strong impact on the planet. And if we want to be around for a long time, let's switch energy sources, which is not a big deal. Like humanity has switched energy sources many times, right? So yeah, the Silurian hypothesis was part of this idea of asking, what does it take for a civilization to be around for a long time? Now, of course, we care about that because I like civilization. You like civilization. We'd like human civilization to be around for a long time. Climate change is clearly a threatens that project. Human beings aren't going to go extinct, but whether or not you can have this super amazing technological civilization where, like, I don't grow any of my food, right? My food just shows up in the grocery store. So we've built a really complex civilization, and can that endure through the pressures that climate change is going to put on? Or nuclear war, another great, existential crisis. AI, who knows? So this question of, like, how long do you last? That's what sort of, the Silurian hypothesis raises. That's what the work I was doing on climate change as a astrobiological phenomena, that was kind of the question.
I assume that paper, I assume you received a very enthusiastic response from the Graham Hancock fans and the pyramid conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, those were the ones. It's actually why Joe Rogan, I was on Joe Rogan because of that paper. Where it's always a bummer because people are like, "Oh, tell me about ancient civilization." I'm like, we didn't say there was one. We're not arguing that there was one. We're just asking the scientific question of how would you know? So people are always like, wah, wah.
Well, I appreciate this, maybe a bit of a low-hanging fruit question, but I'm wondering if we can apply some of your scientific logic to these questions. So when you are following the logic of evolution, what we know, what could we expect, say, as hypothetical alien species to look like? Are there certain characteristics or features that you would bank on there being?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it goes to the heart of, like, the overlap between life and physics, right? Or because, like I said, to me, life is such a amazing. That's really one of my main areas now, is working on what we call the physics of life, trying to understand what makes a cell different from a rock, right? And one of the most important differences there, this is my standard joke. If you've heard it before, sorry, but I love telling it. Like, if you gave me a star and gave me its characteristics, its mass, and its chemical composition, I could tell you everything that's going to happen throughout its entire life. Not the details, but, I can tell you really what its future is like. If you gave me a cell and asked me what's going to happen, there's no way I would, after a billion years, there's no way I would predict a giant rabbit that would punch you in the face, right? A kangaroo. Like, evolution, what evolution shows you is that life is the only system in the entire universe that creates, that goes beyond itself, that innovates, right? That does things that you totally can't predict. So the question of, like, what a life on another planet would look like, you can never answer specifically, right? But when you look at, like, the overlap between the evolution and the challenges that physics and chemistry provide for life, then you can at least say some basic things. So, for example, if you have life that evolves on where you have a hard surface and a gas, well, you got to move around to get food. So you probably are going to end up with something that allows you to move. And one of those things would be jointed sticks, right? Legs. Now, I can't tell you how many legs they're going to be or how many joints they're going to be, but that's a solution that we see on Earth has happened many times. So one thing you do when you want to answer this question is you look at life on Earth and say, how many times did life come up with legs? And how many times were they completely different lineages, like evolutionary lineages? If the atmosphere is thick enough, then flight will be possible. Flight will be a great way of getting around. So let's look at how many times that happened on Earth. Well, you got mammals, bats, right? You've got insects, totally different evolutionary lineage. And then you've got reptiles, which eventually became birds. So that gives you the sense that, like, evolution is going to keep coming up with wings. The wings may look totally different from each other, but the basic idea of wings is something that you're going to hit on. And so what's interesting in this debate, so I can say, like, legs, wings, right? Some kind of light collector, if you're, depending on how dense the atmosphere. Like, if you're in an atmosphere that's super dense and you can't see more than, like, your hand in front of your face, you're probably not going to develop light detectors. It's not helpful, right? You probably do more like with sound. You'll have big ears or something. But in evolution, there's always a balance between what's called contingency, which are accidents, and convergence. So the convergence is what I was just describing. Physics will lead you to wings one way or another, right? But accidents are just as important in evolution, right? So, there's the idea that if you were to go back and rewind the history of Earth's evolution, the life on Earth, and then play it again, you wouldn't end up, there would be no species on here on Earth, on that alternate Earth, than that's here now, because there's so many accidents, right? A rock rolls down and kills the first version of a bat, and that's it. There's no bats, and you end up with something else that looks totally different but has wings. And this is important because one thing it tells you is there's no more humanoids. We are the only, head sitting on top of, shoulders. That is just, there's too many accidents that led to our body plan. So, and again, this does lead to like the UFO stuff with the little green men and the grays and everything. It's like, that is not how evolution works, man. You're not going to get something that looks just like us, except big eyes, and spindly little fingers. As I like to say, when we do find life, what you should be prepared for is not to recognize like, oh, look, it kind of looks like us. Instead, you should be prepared to be A, terrified, and B, completely grossed out, because it probably won't, look anything like us, and will be pretty kind of monstrously scary.
Amazing. I love that. That's so interesting. And using that same logic of science, then let's throw another hypothetical out there. Let's say, aliens have visited us in the past, however many years ago, and that we can't prove that now, as we've already talked about. Using the logic of science and what we know, what possible ways could they have even traveled over such vast distances to visit us?
Yeah. And I thank you for saying the logic of science, because that's really important when we, aliens, everybody loves aliens. I love aliens, right? And it's the cool thing about aliens, why it makes such good science fiction, is just, the imagination, right? You can let your imagination run free. But if you want to do the science of it, then, as you say, you have to apply the logic of science, the way science knows things, right? The way how science thinks it knows things. And those things you can't mess with, right? Because if you messed with them, then you don't end up with science, you end up with crap, right? And, that's why I always like to point out the cell phone, right? If you don't use this like rigorous and frankly boring logic of science, and what I mean by boring is evidence, what we call the standards of evidence. So, science, we're so mean to each other, right? Scientists, where like I'll propose an idea and it's everybody else's job to shred me. If I'm standing up in front of an audience and I make some big claim, like I found evidence of life on another planet, I expect everybody to like come after me with the knives drawn. And if I'm not ready to like parry those knives with the logic of science, then sure, my stuff it's gonna fail. So that logic of science idea is really important, because it's the only reason why we have all this amazing crap in our lives. So yeah, when it comes to interstellar travel, that's a great question, because, interstellar distances, man, they're crazy, I mean, I was going to drop an F-bomb, but I won't go there. They're just so vast that like you could spend all day trying to like imagine just the distance between us and the nearest star, and your mind would just go blank at it. So those distances are so vast that actually coming up with a means of getting yourself there is right now like beyond our wildest technological dreams, right? We can imagine things, but we're not even close to the technology to be able to get us even to the nearest star, which is approximately 4 light years away. That's like the corner store, not even, that's your neighbor's house, right? Trying to get to downtown, if you live in the suburbs, the equivalent of it, because the galaxy, so 4 light years is the closest star. The galaxy is 100,000 light years across, and the distances between galaxies are millions of light years. So, to give you an example, just to really put it into concrete, the fastest thing we've ever created was like the probes that went to have left the solar system, the Voyager probes, and then New Horizons recently. And they're moving, it took them 10 years to get to the edge of our solar system. It would take them 300,000 to 700,000 years, depending on how you want to calculate it, to get to the nearest star, right? So, okay, so how might let's imagine with the physics we understand and go a little bit beyond that, how might you cross interstellar distances? So one is like, you just accept the fact that you can't go faster than the speed of light. Right now, all the laws of physics that we understand say you can't go faster than the speed of light, right? We have some ideas maybe, but nothing is concrete. There's no engine we can imagine that takes us faster than the speed of light. So, okay, you accept the fact that it's going to take a long time. Maybe you come up with a propulsion system. People have talked about like lighting hydrogen bombs off behind a spaceship to push it along, which is, I'm not sure I want to be part of that. But still, then it would take you, a few hundred years. Maybe if you could get up to close to light speed, it would take you a few hundred years. And then you either need hibernation, right? Everybody would have to be frozen, which we don't know how to do, or you'd have a generation ship, right? People would live their entire lives in that spaceship as they're making the journey. So that's one physically, you can imagine it. Another, if we want to step to the next level and imagine, okay, maybe like Einstein's theory of relativity would allow us to use wormholes or something like that. And that one, again, we don't really, the equations of Einstein's theory show you that if you had this thing called negative energy, yeah, you can bend space-time in a way that would allow you to like jump through like wormhole or have a warp drive. But that thing in that equation is something we made up. Like there's no what, it requires something called exotic matter. And really all that exotic matter is something we put in the equation to allow us, without the equation, to describe what we wanted to describe. It's not physical. We dreamed it up. We have no idea whether it could possibly exist. So, but if there was exotic matter, then you could maybe use wormholes. And then the really out there stuff would be something like quantum mechanics, which is just like quantum mechanics is so weird, and it'll that maybe there's some way that quantum mechanics allows you to like disappear from one place and appear another. Again, I literally am pulling this out of my butt. But as it stands right now, with the physics that we understand, is that you're stuck not being able to go faster than light speed, and so then getting to light speed is hard. And then it still leaves you with long travel times between the stars.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And I suppose the other option is you jump on the Millennium Falcon and make the jump to hyperspace, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what warp drive is. Like the warp drive idea, because, they're always, you see that and they're going through this kind of like tunnel thing. That idea is kind of like a wormhole, your self-created wormhole. And that hyperspace is these like tunnels between and so, the warp drive idea has been around for a long time, obviously science fiction wise. And there is a solution in the Einstein's equations that I think it's a Kubre, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in I think 1997, sort of showed that like, okay, here's a solution to the equations that creates kind of a warp bubble, and that warp bubble could move, through, not really through space time, but could warp space fast so that it would, you could move faster than light. But again, it's just a theoretical thing. It requires this exotic energy. So, it's an open question about whether that's just a theoretical fiction or not. Well, exciting.
Very.
Hope we can do it.
The the last question topic I really wanted to ask you about is, say we were to encounter some evidence of even microbial life. Obviously, that's going to have a massive impact on, our understanding of life's origins and its sort of ubiquity across the universe. But I wonder what you think the impact would be on society, both cultural and politically. Obviously, there's parts of the world that are built on this idea of God creating us humans and how special we are. But what do you think that evidence of, say, microbial life would do for society? What impact would it have?
Yeah, I think, it would be the greatest scientific, cultural, and philosophical discovery in the history of humanity. It would absolutely, now, like, I don't think anybody's going to be rioting in the streets. I'm not worried about that. Even if we found evidence of a technological civilization 40 light years away, it's 40 light years away. We can't get there unless they visited us. People might riot in the streets, and God knows we've watched lots of good movies about that if they showed up. But if we discovered, evidence of intelligent life a long way away, people wouldn't riot in the streets. But like in terms of how we think about ourselves and our place in the universe, absolutely, it would. Religions would have to deal with it. Philosophy would have to deal with it. And I think what it would show is that, what the real profound part would be that it would show us that life is not rare, right? Because we, as of right now, we only know of one example, and that may mean that all the weirdness that is life, the weirdness of a cell, it could be a one-off, could be a cosmic accident that never happened anywhere else. But if we have even one example of another, what we call abiogenesis event, that life has formed somewhere else, there has been abiogenesis, the creation of life from non-life. That would force us to understand that, life is probably common. And again, going back to this idea that I was saying, life creates, life innovates. And so if we have an example of, if we know that life is common, then what has it done? Like how life is, there's no, like, life doesn't have limits in a certain way. And so, like, it opens up these profound possibilities about how woven in some sense into the fabric of the universe life might be. How far, if you get intelligent civilizations which become profoundly technological and, work their way into the laws of physics themselves, you can get as science fiction-y as you want. But even one example of another form of life would open up that possibility.
Well, Adam, this has been an absolute pleasure and a privilege. You've been a guest I've wanted to speak to on this show for many years, so I really appreciate your time today. It's been thoroughly enjoyable, and time has flown by. But for everyone listening or watching right now, this may be their first introduction into your work. I mentioned some of your books at the top. Where's the best place everyone can go right now if they're thinking, I want to hear more from Adam, I want to connect? Where's the best place we can send them to?
Let's see. You can go to my website. If you just Google Adam Frank Science, you'll find lots of stuff from me. So I think that's the best place. So along with this podcast, I've done other podcasts. I did Lex Fridman recently. Yeah. I write for The Atlantic often. And I'm also starting a newsletter, probably on Beehive. So look for that. That will be coming. But the best place is to go to my website, because that sort of has the compendium of stuff, of scientific articles I've written, popular articles I've written. And then when I launch the Beehive newsletter, which I'm really looking forward to, that will be a good place. Social media, I have sort of dropped out of social media because it's just I just feel better when I'm not on it. Yeah. I don't care what platform it is. It's like, I just am more calm when I just don't go on it. So, so probably social media is not the place to find me. But, my website will give people direction to the books and articles I'm writing, and eventually the Beehive.
Amazing. Well, I'll make sure that's linked in the description below for everyone listening and watching right now. Just click the description. All those links mentioned will be there. I'd like to sign off the episode in the same way we do every show, whether the guest is an astrophysicist, an athlete, an actor. I ask the very same question, and it's quite apt because we've been talking about life and whether it is rare or not so rare and quite common. But for Adam Frank right now, what makes a life worth living?
I'm gonna be corny here, and I'm gonna say it's love, right? I mean, which is the corniest thing you could possibly say.
No,
but I am also, I've been a Zen practitioner, doing contemplative practice for the last 30 years. I've been staring at a wall for 30 years. And, one of the most essential things I learned from Zen practice, because I came to Zen practice, because, I was suffering like everybody suffers, I was going through whatever difficulties I had. And I was hoping that contemplative practice, meditation would be helpful. But I also came because I wanted truth, I wanted like the ultimate truth. And what I found was, this cracked me up, was that you can't get there without compassion. Like, that's a fundamental tenet of the whole sort of thing with Buddhism, is like, without like a deep, this profound, like, engaging with all in your life in every aspect with compassion for other beings, because everybody is suffering, everybody's having a hard time, in one way or the other, animals, you people. So you have to have compassion, and what is compassion but love? It actually turns out that anything you want in life runs through love and so, especially in these crazy, partisan, insane times, this moment in history, not vilifying other people, whether they're, have different political opinions. In my world, like Yankees fans, like, I have to love Yankees fans. Fine. Terrible team, but as a Met fan, I can still appreciate that, they're human beings too. So the answer is love.
Amazing. Well, I think you'll appreciate I'm not, I didn't grow up watching baseball. Obviously, I live in the UK. It's not big here. But on the one occasion I did go to America, I went to New York, and I went to, I went to a Mets versus Yankees game, and I've got some Mets merch somewhere in the house. I'm an adopted Mets fan. So,
all right. We're best friends now. See, there we go.
Amazing. Oh, Adam, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Great, Lewis. Thank you so much, too. Take care, man.